From time-traveling refrigerators to accidental hangings on set, the journey of bringing Marty McFly to the big screen was packed with bizarre twists that would make Doc Brown's head spin. The movie that defined a generation nearly didn't exist at all, rejected over 40 times, accused of promoting incest by Disney, and starring an actor who wasn't even the first choice. Behind the iconic DeLorean and lightning-struck clock tower lies a treasure trove of strange production secrets, dangerous stunts gone wrong, and musical cameos you've been watching for decades without realizing. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Back to the Future. Fact 1. The time machine was originally a refrigerator. It's hard to imagine Back to the Future without the iconic DeLorean, but in the earliest versions of the script written back in 1981, Doc Brown's time machine was actually a refrigerator. Not just any fridge, but a lead-lined refrigerator that would be loaded onto the back of a truck and driven into the Nevada desert for a nuclear weapons test. Marty would have climbed inside the refrigerator to shield himself from the atomic blast, and the massive energy from the explosion would have powered the time travel device, sending him back to 1955. The whole concept was much more complicated than what ended up in the final film, requiring multiple steps and a lot more setup than simply hitting 88 miles per hour in a sports car. Director Robert Zemeckis and writer Bob Gale eventually abandoned the refrigerator idea for two main reasons. First, they became concerned that kids watching the movie might actually try to recreate the time travel by climbing into their family refrigerators and locking themselves inside, which was a serious safety hazard in the 1980s when many refrigerators still had latches that could trap children. Second, and perhaps more importantly, from a filmmaking perspective, they realized that having a mobile time machine would open up far more exciting storytelling possibilities. With a car, Marty could drive around 1955, escape from danger, and create thrilling chase sequences that simply wouldn't be possible with a stationary refrigerator. The change to a DeLorean with its futuristic gull-wing doors that made it look like a spaceship ended up being one of the smartest creative decisions in the entire production. Fact 2. Eric Stoltz was fired after 5 weeks of filming. Michael J. Fox wasn't the original Marty McFly, and the story of how he got the role is one of the strangest casting changes in Hollywood history. Actor Eric Stoltz, who had just received critical acclaim for his performance in the film Mask, was initially cast as Marty and spent 5 full weeks filming scenes for Back to the Future starting in November of 1984. The problem was that Stoltz approached the role with intense seriousness, using method acting techniques that clashed with the light comedic tone the filmmakers were trying to achieve. He insisted that everyone on set call him Marty, even when the cameras weren't rolling, which frustrated the crew, and his performance in the completed scenes felt too heavy and dramatic for what was supposed to be a fun adventure comedy. Christopher Lloyd, who played Doc Brown, later recalled being so confused by Stoltz's commitment to staying in character that he genuinely didn't know the actor's real name for weeks. After reviewing the footage, director Robert Zemeckis and producer Steven Spielberg made the difficult decision to fire Stoltz and reshoot everything with Michael J. Fox, who had always been their first choice but was unavailable due to his commitment to the television show Family Ties. This decision added $4 million to the budget and required going back to film everything again. However, if you watch the film carefully, you can actually spot Eric Stoltz in one brief moment that they never reshot. The scene where Marty, wearing the yellow radiation suit, jumps into the DeLorean and speeds away from the Libyan terrorists in the Twin Pines Mall parking lot. Fact 3. Michael J. Fox filmed 2 projects simultaneously. When Michael J. Fox finally took over the role of Marty McFly, he faced an absolutely brutal filming schedule that would exhaust even the most energetic performer. Fox was still contractually obligated to his hit television show, Family Ties, which meant he couldn't simply leave the sitcom to focus on the movie. Instead, he had to do both at the same time, working what essentially amounted to 2 full-time jobs for several months. His daily routine involved filming Family Ties at Paramount Studios during regular daytime hours. then rushing over to the Back to the Future set, where he would work through the night, often not wrapping until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. After getting home, he would catch just a few hours of sleep before waking up and starting the whole cycle over again. Looking back on the experience in interviews years later, Fox admitted that he was running almost entirely on adrenaline and was so exhausted that he barely knew where he was half the time or what he was doing. He described being in a constant state of disorientation and fatigue that made everything feel surreal. However, this extreme exhaustion actually ended up working perfectly for the character because Marty McFly is supposed to be confused, disoriented, and overwhelmed by suddenly finding himself thrown back in time to 1955. The genuine bewilderment and slightly frantic energy that Fox brought to the role partly came from his real-life state of exhaustion. Despite the grueling schedule, Fox's performance became iconic and helped turn Back to the Future into the highest-grossing film of 1985. Fact 4. Huey Lewis rejected his own song in a secret cameo. One of the cleverest inside jokes in Back to the Future happens in the opening scene, when Marty McFly and his band, the Pinheads, audition for their high school's Battle of the Bands competition. The nerdy-looking judge wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a suit who interrupts their performance and tells them, "I'm afraid you're just too darn loud," is actually Huey Lewis, the famous rock singer, appearing in an uncredited cameo that most viewers never notice. The brilliant irony of this moment is that Marty's band was performing a heavy rock version of The Power of Love, which was written and performed by Huey Lewis and the News specifically for the Back to the Future soundtrack, meaning Lewis was essentially rejecting his own song. Director Robert Zemeckis came up with the idea for this cameo after Lewis had already agreed to write music for the film, and Lewis was initially hesitant about appearing on camera. He eventually agreed on 2 conditions: that he would remain uncredited and that he would be disguised so he wouldn't be immediately recognizable to audiences. Lewis later said he based his character on a square, unfashionable record company employee he used to work with, adopting the man's stiff mannerisms and way of speaking. The filmmakers even shot an alternate ending to the scene where Marty responds to the rejection by asking, "What do you want, Huey Lewis?" But they wisely cut that line because it would have made the joke far too obvious. Lewis himself later commented that he thought the cameo worked perfectly as a subtle inside joke that fans of his music could appreciate while still being funny to everyone else. Fact 5. The script was rejected over 40 times before. Back to the Future became the highest-grossing film of 1985. It was rejected more than 40 times by every major Hollywood studio, with some studios turning it down multiple times whenever new management came in. Writer Bob Gale and director Robert Zemeckis heard the same 2 criticisms over and over again during their years of trying to sell the script. First, studio executives kept saying that time travel movies were box office poison and nobody wanted to see them, pointing to recent failures like The Final Countdown and Time Bandits. Second, they were told the script was too sweet and wholesome for the 1980s audience when the most successful comedies were raunchy, sexually explicit films like Porky's and Animal House, and studios wanted something much more adult-oriented and inappropriate. The most absurd rejection came from Disney, which multiple studios had suggested as the perfect home for such a family-friendly story. When Gale and Zemeckis finally took the script to Disney executives, they were met with outrage rather than interest. One Disney executive told them they were insane for even bringing the project there, saying the studio couldn't possibly make a movie where a teenage mother develops romantic feelings for her own son, even though he's a time traveler from the future. The executive specifically called out the scene where Lorraine McFly gets in a car with Marty and declared it was incest and far too dirty for the Disney brand. The irony was almost too perfect. Most studios thought the script was too innocent and nice, while Disney thought it was scandalously inappropriate, leaving Gale and Zemeckis stuck in the middle until Steven Spielberg finally saw the potential and helped get the film made at Universal Studios. Fact 6. Eddie Van Halen provided the alien guitar solo. In one of the film's most memorable scenes, Marty McFly dresses up in a radiation suit and sneaks into his teenage father's bedroom in the middle of the night, pretending to be an alien named Darth Vader from the planet Vulcan in order to scare George McFly into asking Lorraine to the school dance. To make the performance more convincing and terrifying, Marty puts headphones on the sleeping George and blasts ear-splitting guitar noises through his Walkman. And those screeching, distorted sounds were actually performed by Eddie Van Halen, one of the most famous rock guitarists in the world at the time. If you look closely at the cassette tape when Marty loads it into the Walkman, you can see it's labeled Edward Van Halen rather than just Van Halen, and there's a specific reason for this unusual choice of words. Eddie Van Halen had personally agreed to contribute to the film and recorded the chaotic guitar solo specifically for that scene. But the rest of his band hadn't given their approval for the Van Halen name to appear in the movie. To work around this legal issue, the filmmakers used Eddie's real first name instead, writing Edward in much smaller letters above Van Halen on the tape label so they could credit him individually without implying the whole band was involved. Van Halen himself was characteristically modest about his contribution, later describing it in an interview as just a bunch of noise rather than any kind of serious musical performance. He confirmed in 2012 that it really was him playing on that tape, finally settling decades of fan speculation about whether the legendary guitarist had actually participated in the film. Fact 7. Ronald Reagan loved the movie and referenced it in Congress. President Ronald Reagan, who was serving in the White House when Back to the Future was released, absolutely loved the film and found one scene particularly hilarious. In the movie, when Marty McFly tells Doc Brown that Ronald Reagan is the President of the United States in 1985, Doc responds with complete disbelief, saying, "Ronald Reagan, the actor?" before sarcastically asking if comedian Jerry Lewis is the vice president and suggesting that Reagan's ex-wife, Jane Wyman, must be the first lady. When Reagan watched the film during a private screening at the White House, he was so entertained by this joke about himself that he actually had the projectionist stop the movie and replay that specific scene so he could enjoy it a second time, finding the idea of Doc Brown's shocked reaction genuinely amusing rather than offensive. Reagan's appreciation for the film didn't end there, because less than a year later, during his 1986 State of the Union address to Congress, he directly quoted one of the movie's most famous lines. While discussing America's future and technological progress, Reagan said, as they said in the film Back to the Future, "Where we're going, we don't need roads," referencing the moment at the end of the movie when Doc Brown's modified flying DeLorean lifts off into the sky. The fact that a sitting president would quote a science fiction comedy in such a formal, important speech shows just how deeply Back to the Future had penetrated American popular culture within its first year of release. And it gave the film an unexpected presidential endorsement that probably helped boost its already impressive box office performance. Fact 8. The Twin Pines Mall becomes Lone Pine Mall. One of the most clever and easily missed details in Back to the Future is a visual gag that confirms Marty McFly actually changed the timeline with his actions in the past. At the beginning of the film, when Marty first meets Doc Brown to witness the time travel experiment, they're in the parking lot of Twin Pines Mall, and you can clearly see the illuminated sign at the entrance showing 2 pine trees as part of the mall's logo. Doc even mentions during their conversation that the land used to be owned by Old Man Peabody, who had the crazy dream of breeding pine trees on his ranch and had planted 2 young pine trees as the start of his ambitious plan. When Marty accidentally travels back to 1955 and crashes the DeLorean into Peabody's barn, he's immediately confronted by the farmer and his family, who think he's an alien invader and start shooting at him with a shotgun. As Marty frantically speeds away from the property in the time machine, he accidentally runs over and destroys one of the 2 small pine trees that were standing in Peabody's front yard, the very same trees that Doc had mentioned earlier. Later in the film, when Marty successfully returns to 1985 and arrives back at the mall to save Doc Brown from the Libyan terrorists, the sign at the entrance no longer reads Twin Pines Mall, but instead says Lone Pine Mall, reflecting the fact that only 1 pine tree survived on Peabody's property after Marty's visit 30 years earlier. This small background detail is the first subtle hint that Marty's time travel adventure has created an alternate timeline. Fact 9. Christopher Lloyd did his own stunts despite fear of heights. The climactic clock tower sequence at the end of Back to the Future is one of the most iconic scenes in the entire film, showing Doc Brown desperately hanging from the ledge of the Hill Valley Courthouse clock tower as he tries to reconnect a cable that will harness the lightning strike needed to send Marty back to the future. What makes this scene even more impressive is that Christopher Lloyd, the actor playing Doc Brown, has a serious fear of heights, but still performed most of the dangerous stunts himself rather than relying entirely on a stunt double. The long shots that show Doc standing on the narrow ledge high above the ground were actually filmed with Lloyd himself on a real building overlooking the Universal Studios backlot, putting him in genuinely dangerous positions despite his phobia. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, Lloyd was so uncomfortable with the height requirements that he tried to suggest an alternative approach to director Robert Zemeckis, proposing that Doc Brown could perhaps crawl along the perilous ledge instead of standing upright, which would have been less visually dramatic but much easier for an actor afraid of heights to perform. Zemeckis immediately shut down this idea with a blunt response, telling Lloyd there was no way they were changing the scene to accommodate his fear. A professional stunt performer who had circus experience did handle the most dangerous part, where Doc slides down a cable from the clock tower to the ground, and some close-up shots were filmed on a safer soundstage set. But Lloyd deserves credit for facing his fear and performing the majority of the sequence himself. Fact 10. A stunt woman shattered her face. During filming. While filming the hoverboard chase sequence for Back to the Future Part 2, stunt woman Cheryl Wheeler suffered one of the most serious injuries in the entire trilogy during what should have been a carefully controlled stunt. The scene required several stunt performers playing members of the villain Griff's gang to crash through a large stained glass window at the Hill Valley Clock Tower while suspended on cables, then fall safely onto inflatable airbags positioned below. Wheeler was doubling for the female gang member named Spike, and the plan was for a technician to remotely release her rigging at exactly the right moment so her forward momentum would carry her cleanly through the breakaway glass and down to the waiting safety cushions. Unfortunately, multiple last-minute changes to the stunt setup caused everything to go horribly wrong. The crew had switched from regular breakaway glass to candy glass, which was less transparent and made it harder for the technician operating the release mechanism to see the performers clearly, and smoke from a newly added rocket effect further obscured his view. When Wheeler was launched toward the window, her rigging sent her off course, and she slammed directly into a concrete pillar next to the window instead of going through it. To make matters even worse, because the technician couldn't see that she had hit the pillar and failed to make it through the window, he released her cable anyway, causing her to fall 25 feet down to the hard concrete pavement outside the building, rather than landing on the protective airbags that had been set up inside. Wheeler shattered her face and right wrist in the fall and required extensive reconstructive surgery, yet incredibly, the filmmakers kept the footage of her hitting the pillar in the final cut of the movie. Fact 11. Michael J. Fox actually lost consciousness. During a hanging scene. Michael J. Fox came dangerously close to dying on the set of Back to the Future Part 3 during the filming of a scene where the villain Buford Mad Dog Tannen attempts to lynch Marty McFly by hanging him from a gallows before Doc Brown shoots the rope to save him at the last second. Fox had volunteered to perform the close-up shots of the hanging himself, while stunt performers would handle the wider shots from a distance. And during the rehearsals, everything had gone smoothly, with the noose remaining loose enough for Fox to breathe safely. However, when they filmed the actual take, something went terribly wrong, and the rope became too tight, cutting off Fox's air supply and causing him to lose consciousness while dangling from the noose. The most disturbing part of this near tragedy is that nobody on the film crew immediately realized what was happening, because they all assumed Fox was simply giving an incredibly convincing performance of someone being strangled. In his memoir titled Lucky Man, Fox later wrote about the experience and described how he swung unconscious at the end of the rope for several seconds before director Robert Zemeckis finally understood that even Fox wasn't that good of an actor and something had gone seriously wrong. The crew quickly cut Fox down and revived him, and thankfully, he wasn't seriously injured, despite being strangled to the point of passing out. If you watch the finished film closely, you can actually see Fox's very real struggle in that scene, as the genuine distress visible on his face was not acting, but the result of actually being unable to breathe. Fact 12. The film features over 20 Pepsi product placements. If you pay close attention while watching Back to the Future, you'll notice Pepsi products appearing constantly throughout the film, with over 20 different instances of the brand showing up in various forms, including bottles, cans, signs, clocks, and even delivery trucks. This wasn't an accident or the result of random set decoration choices, but rather a very deliberate strategy by director Robert Zemeckis and writer Bob Gale, who explained in the DVD commentary that they specifically looked for brands and products that had undergone noticeable visual changes between 1955 and 1985. They wanted to use real companies whose logos and packaging designs had evolved significantly over those 30 years because it would help emphasize the time travel aspects of the story and make the differences between the two time periods more visually obvious to audiences. Pepsi was chosen over its main competitor, Coca-Cola, specifically because Pepsi's logo, bottle design, and overall branding had changed dramatically during that 3-decade span, while Coca-Cola's classic bottle shape and logo had remained relatively consistent and recognizable. Interestingly, in the very first drafts of the Back to the Future script, Coca-Cola actually played a much more important role in the story, because the time machine was originally powered by a chemical reaction that occurred when Coke was accidentally spilled into the plutonium power circuits, and the screenplay even called for Marty to return to a version of 1985 where Coca-Cola had somehow become the world's main energy source. Obviously, this bizarre concept was abandoned in later rewrites, but it shows how product placement was baked into the film's DNA from the very beginning. Fact 13. Crispin Glover sued over his likeness in Part 2. Crispin Glover, who played Marty's father George McFly in the first Back to the Future film, did not return for the 2 sequels, and the reasons behind his absence led to one of the most significant legal battles in Hollywood history. Glover had 2 main issues that prevented him from reprising his role. First, he couldn't reach an agreement with the studio about his salary for the sequels, and second, he had serious philosophical objections to the ending of the first film, believing it sent the wrong message by rewarding the McFly family with wealth and material possessions, rather than simply showing them as happier people who were in love with each other. When the filmmakers decided to move forward with Back to the Future Part 2 without Glover, they came up with a controversial solution to explain George McFly's limited screen presence in the sequel. They reused some footage of Glover from the original film, and for new scenes, they hired a different actor named Jeffrey Weissman to wear prosthetic makeup and a molded mask designed to make him look like Glover, essentially fooling audiences into thinking Glover had actually appeared in the movie. When Glover discovered what the filmmakers had done, he filed a lawsuit against the producers for using his likeness without permission. And he ultimately won a settlement reported to be $760,000. This case became so important that it led the Screen Actors Guild to create new rules protecting actors from having their appearances recreated or manipulated without their explicit consent, fundamentally changing how the entertainment industry handles issues of likeness rights and digital recreations of performers. Fact 14. The head of Universal wanted to call it Spaceman from Pluto. It's almost impossible to imagine Back to the Future being called anything else, but the film's iconic title nearly got replaced with something far less appealing thanks to an executive decision that would have changed movie history. Sid Sheinberg, who was the head of Universal Studios at the time, absolutely hated the title Back to the Future and thought it sounded boring and wouldn't attract audiences to theaters. He sent an official memo to director Robert Zemeckis and the production team demanding that they change the title to Spaceman from Pluto, which was a reference to the scene in the film where George McFly believes Marty is an alien visitor after the radiation suit incident, even though Marty actually claims to be from the planet Vulcan rather than Pluto. Zemeckis and producer Steven Spielberg knew this would be a terrible title that could potentially hurt the film's chances of success, But they also couldn't just openly refuse a direct order from the studio chief without damaging their relationship with Universal. Instead, they came up with a clever solution by sending Sheinberg a reply memo thanking him profusely for his wonderful joke and saying how much they appreciated his great sense of humor in suggesting such a funny fake title to lighten the mood during the stressful final stages of production. Sheinberg received their response and, not wanting to admit that he had been completely serious about the title change, decided to play along and accept their thanks for his supposed joke. He quietly dropped his demand to rename the film, and Back to the Future kept its original title, which went on to become one of the most recognizable movie names in cinema history. Fact 15. Robert Zemeckis nearly cast. Ronald Reagan in Part 3. After Ronald Reagan left the White House and returned to private life, director Robert Zemeckis saw an opportunity to bring the former president into the Back to the Future franchise in a way that would have been a perfect full-circle moment. When planning Back to the Future Part 3, which was set in the Old West town of Hill Valley in 1885, Zemeckis wanted Reagan to play the role of the town's mayor, capitalizing on Reagan's background as a Western film actor before he entered politics. The offer was delivered to Reagan in 1989 through Lew Wasserman, who was a major movie industry executive and had been Reagan's agent for many years, making the approach feel personal and legitimate rather than just a random casting inquiry. According to Mark Weinberg, who was Reagan's special advisor and press secretary at the time and later wrote about the experience in his memoir, the former president was genuinely flattered by Zemeckis' offer and gave it serious consideration for a while. Weinberg suspected that part of Reagan probably wanted to accept the role and make his return to acting in such a high-profile franchise, especially given how much he had enjoyed the first film. However, after thinking it over carefully, Reagan ultimately decided to decline the cameo appearance. His reasoning, as Weinberg later recounted, was both thoughtful and poetic. Reagan said that he loved the past but never needed to live in it, suggesting that his days as an actor were behind him, and he was content to move forward rather than returning to his old career even for a fun guest appearance.